MBA student. I'm also one of the teaching assistants for Professor Creary's Leading Diversity at Wharton class. I would like to first introduce Dean Garrett. Dean Jeffery Garrett has been Dean of the Wharton School since 2014. He also writes a regular blog as a LinkedIn influencer, which has included a popular article from August 2018, Why Diversity is About Much More Than Numbers. Please help me in welcoming to the stage Dean Jeffery Garrett.
Welcome and good afternoon, everybody. I won't reprise that article because those of you who know it know that it's got a Seinfeld, an old bad Seinfeld joke in it. Anyone remember Seinfeld in the room? Maybe. Ancient history. Do you remember the Elaine bad dancing in Seinfeld? That was the joke in this article. But I do want to introduce, apropos today's conversation, a different word to you, and it's an old English word that I remember from 30 years ago when my first academic job. I was a young Australian in Oxford, England, feeling completely out of place. And they had a term in England called clubbable. And typically someone would say dismissively, X is not clubbable. Anyway, I remember this term because I was not clubbable in my Oxford college. And what did not clubbable mean? It meant that you didn't fit the culture of the institution because you weren't the same. And there was a second meaning to clubbable. So this was club, which really meant gentleman's club, with tweed jackets and cigars and brandy snifters, that kind of thing. But the second meaning of clubbable was you couldn't be beaten over the head and made to conform. So because I was an Australian and therefore they thought I was descended from convicts in England, they used to make lots of jokes about me that I wasn't very clubbable. And I remember that because I think it's taken on an enormous and a new meaning, the antithesis, in our corporate world, right? So for a long time, we used to talk politely about fit for the culture. And fit for the culture literally meant not standing out. We had an anti-diversity view of what was good for organizations. Oh, X might be an interesting person, but X really won't fit in our culture. They're not clubbable, right? That was a way we thought about organizations, and that was a legitimate screening filter on whom we hired and in today's conversation, who we might want to put on boards. So contrast that with certainly the world that I see today. I've said this to Stephanie several times, I think. I have a really easy way for myself to understand the value of diversity in organizations. And it's actually to think about maybe the metaphor of the boardroom table, which could also just be any decision-making table. If I sit around a table with 9 or 10 other people who think exactly the way I think, the collective intelligence in the room is not increased at all by all of those people because we're literally clones of each other. Contrast that with a more diverse board or meeting room table, and you have the possibility of much higher collective intelligence and much better decision making. But I underline possibility because it isn't going to work. It's not enough. Back to diversity is about more than the numbers. It's not enough just to put a diverse group of people together, because what happens if that is an oil and water experience where people feel alienated, where what divides you is more important than what unites you? So when I think about this, I think about the incredible upside that comes from having a diverse organization, a diverse board, but understanding that the obligation on leaders to empower everybody around a table and therefore to enhance the collective intelligence of the group, it's a really high responsibility. We can't just jam a bunch of people onto my mythical table and expect them to function coherently. It's actually no pressure on the chair. In a board context, I think it's an incredible responsibility of a chair. So when Stephanie asked me whether I could come to this session this afternoon, like all of you in the room, I enthusiastically stuck up my hand. I didn't think I was going to have to speak. But when I was thinking about what I might say earlier today, I was struck by this old version of British society that I remember from 30 years ago with this notion of clubability. You could be a member of my club because you were the same as I was, and even if you weren't, I could beat you over the head until you became the way I wanted you to be, right? It was an absolute conformity culture. Contrast that with the world we live in today, where we want more diversity in everything. But I think, certainly in a business school context, the important point to underline is not only is diversity important in terms of how we regard individuals and giving all individuals appropriate respect and make them feel trusted and belong to an organization. It's about improving the collective performance of any organization. And if you can do that, you are so much ahead of the game, but it requires real leadership. So the very good news is we have lots of real leaders sitting in the front row. The even better news is I'm going to stop speaking right now. I don't know what happens next, but I presume Stephanie is going to get up. Stephanie is not going to get up. Our wonderful moderator is going to get up. Thanks very much for being involved in the class. I'll just end by saying it was certainly an aspiration for me 3 or 4 years ago to make leading diversity a core attribute of every Wharton graduate. There are now 150 times 2 of you taking this wonderful class. So that's not quite the 5,000 students at Wharton, but it's a really good start. So I'm so pleased that this room is full. And like everyone else, I'm going to sit down and listen because I know we've got an incredible panel in front of us. Thanks, Stephanie, for organizing. Thanks so much, Olivia, for helping out. And thanks to our wonderful guests who no doubt will get introduced in a second. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dean Garrett. It is now my pleasure to introduce the moderator and panelists for this evening's event. So our moderator is Stephanie Creary. She is an assistant professor of management here at the Wharton School. Professor Creary is an identity and diversity scholar, and her research focuses on how workers learn from their differences and reveals how they engage their multiple identities in an enhancing way to cultivate positive identities and improve the quality of relationships across difference. Currently, Professor Creary teaches a course she recently developed, Leading Diversity in Organizations, to Wharton undergraduate and MBA students, and she is the visionary behind the Leading Diversity at Wharton Speaker Series. Next, we have Janet Foutty. Janet Foutty is chair of the board at Deloitte and a member of Deloitte's Global Board of Directors. As chair of the board, she leads by providing governance and oversight on critical business matters for the firm, including strategy, brand positioning, risk mitigation, talent development, and leadership succession. Janet is a frequent author and popular public speaker, and she regularly communicates with executive-level audiences about the changing business landscape, the C-suite of tomorrow, the workforce of the future, tech disruption, and leadership. She is a passionate advocate for inclusion in the workplace, women in technology, and the need for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or STEM, education, founding women in technology groups in India and the United States. And last but certainly not least, we have Jeffery Smith. Jeffery Smith serves as managing member, chief executive officer, and chief investment officer of Starboard Value, and the chair of the board at Papa John's. Over the last decade, Starboard has been among the most active change agent investors in the world, having added or replaced approximately 190 board members on 55 different public company boards. A Wharton alumnus Jeff has returned to share his insights after serving on a number of boards and serving as chair on the board of several companies. Please help me in welcoming Stephanie Creary, Janet Foutty, and Jeffery.
Well, wow, what a big house. Thank you all for being here. 136 of you were required to be here, and the other 100 or so were not. So this was certainly quite the awe-inspiring RSVP list. So I thank all of you, no matter whether you're required to be here or not, for taking time out of your busy lives to join us with what I think will be a very interesting, somewhat provocative panel looking at the topics of what corporate boards can really do about diversity. So a couple of words before we get started. I want to say thank you to Dean Garrett. I joined the faculty of the Wharton School in July of 2017, and I was a little bit anxious about teaching a diversity course. I'm not going to lie. My students know this. I talk about this all the time. I wasn't really sure how it fit into the finance school's mission or into the curriculum. And when I asked him in my first quarter teaching this class in November 27 to come to the class, he actually didn't know at that time that I was going to ask him to say a few words, but it was then chair of the board of Deloitte, Mike Foutty, and chief inclusion officer, Terry Cooper, who came to talk about diversity and inclusion. And Dean Garrett came, and at the end he spoke, and I know that was really meaningful for the students. Back then I only had 60 students enrolled in 2 sections, and now we've gone up to 6 sections of diversity and 300 students per year. And I think it's certainly a testament to the resources that this school has put behind this topic, Dean Garrett's support in allowing me to brand a speaker series around diversity. We were actually having people who weren't enrolled in the class wanting to come and see some of our auspicious guests. And so we decided to create a hybrid platform where my students would come, certainly, but we would open it up to the community. So thank you so much for your support these past couple of years. I want to say Happy Veterans Day. I have quite a few students in my classes who are veterans of the U.S. Armed Forces, and I want to say that we are grateful to you, a couple here in the front. We are grateful to you for your sacrifices, for your service, for allowing us to feel safe and to be free. So can we take a moment to thank our veterans? They didn't know when they signed up to come back to school that they would have to be in school on many federal holidays, including Veterans Day. So thank you for being here today. So as I mentioned, this is a hybrid event. This is part of an academic course, Leading Diversity at Wharton, in organizations at Wharton. I have students who are in an MBA section of all MBA students, and then I have 2 undergrad sections where more than half of the students are from the Wharton undergraduate class, and the rest are doing amazing things in the other schools and colleges. Today I had lunch with some of the students, and one, I won't look at her, point her out, is actually going to work for NASA, wants to be an astronaut. So it's just such an amazing wealth of students and intellectual capital that takes the courses, gives us a lot of great information, and I'm pleased to be able to share what I know with them and have them share with me as well. But one of the things I think my students are really always curious about and maybe conscious of on the first day of class is how do we have conversations about diversity and inclusion that actually feel like real learning opportunities. And so the first day, we review the syllabus, but we actually spend some time setting ground rules and some norms that they want to abide by for having these conversations. So I thought I'd just take a few minutes to share some of those, to give ideas to our guests here about how they can continue to engage in these conversations. I know lots of people who've come here run clubs at the university, and they also want to go into organizations and sponsor conversations about diversity and inclusion. But what we do is we talk about 3 values that students who take my class say that are important to them, and what helps them to feel engaged in the class and to feel like they should keep coming back for more. And the first one is the principle of engaging respectfully with others. And I think in the context of the class, the way that this looks like is how do we meet people where they are we don't all enter into a conversation about diversity and inclusion with the same experiences or the same amount of experience talking about this topic. So how do we agree to disagree and respectfully disagree, I think, is a core tenet of the class. The second is about listening actively and being constructive. And so when someone says something that maybe gets a little bit under our skin because it's not the type of language that we're used to hearing in our own worlds, how do we give them the benefit of the doubt that maybe it's the word choice and not the person is evil? So we spend a lot of time talking about that, not being overly reactive to some of the things that we hear. And the last is, I think the students really value the fact that we try to build a community around this topic. We've gone back and forth between talking about a safe space versus a brave space. I'm a person who believes in brave spaces where I feel that minority voices should be heard, even if your minority voice is one that's not typically heard when we're talking about diversity. How do we express an openness and a willingness to understand diverse perspectives? So those are the values that my students appreciate, and we wanted to share those with you today, just so you know, I think, how we're entering into this conversation. So for about the next 30 minutes or so, I will engage with Janet and Jeff in a conversation about our topic. And then in the last 10 to 15 minutes or so, we'll invite you all to engage as well with your questions. So what I have learned is lots of people are excited about this topic, but not everybody really understands what corporate boards do. So maybe we can talk for a few minutes about what corporate boards do. What are their roles and responsibilities, and how does that differ from the roles and responsibilities of management teams? Janet, do you want to start?
Certainly. So first of all, thank you so much for having me here to engage on this fabulous topic. My predecessor had done some research with Stephanie and her team, and as I transition to my role, I'm delighted to continue the conversation. Second thing I have to say is there's an unbelievable sunset out the window, and I'm not normally distracted. Yes, unbelievable. I feel like I'm the invited guest, and this was just for me, so thank you for that. And third, before we get started, is I just want to echo your shout out to our veterans. That's not a cohort of diversity that I would say I appreciated for much of my career, even though I'm actually the child of a veteran, until I went to go run our federal business, and I came to have a deep appreciation for the importance of that dimension of how we think about diversity. So thank you for calling that out. And I actually spend many Veterans Days with our veterans community in some form or fashion. So really wonderful to have that dimension of the discussion today. So I spent most of my career in leading big parts of Deloitte, in client service, and then leading big parts of Deloitte. And just got asked over the last year to transition in to be the full-time executive chair of Deloitte. And so I thought it would be good for me to just give you a couple of quick perspectives on what is different in leading a board versus leading a management team, which is where I spent most of my life. So just a couple of quick tidbits for you all. First and foremost, the board is the ultimate conscience of the organization in terms of how we think about everything from setting strategy to CEO succession to risk management and dealing with crises within risk management, but also being out in front of them. And so you might look at those things and think about, well, why is inclusion in the conversation in the boardroom? And what I can tell you is that, and I'm sure we'll get into this, is that having a diverse set of voices around the proverbial table, as the dean shared, and having an inclusive discussion around the table, which is something that Stephanie and I have spent a lot of time talking about, creates a very, very different lens into, I believe, organizational performance. And so helping our management team, which what we do is help guide and support our management team, think about how diversity and inclusion is an important dimension of the business. I'm sure we'll talk lots more about, but that's just a quick synopsis. So risk management, strategy, CEO and broad succession, and really supporting and helping guide the management team is how I and the other board members spend our time.
Okay. Jeff, you want to add?
Yeah, sure. Again, and thank you for having me. It's nice to be here. It's nice to be back on campus. It's nice to see at least a few faces, maybe more. How many have met me before or been in a lecture that I've done before? I guess a few before.
Yeah.
Great. So thank you for coming back. It's great to be here. So boards. So I come at it from a slightly different lens. It's almost the same, but it's slightly different in that it's public companies. So public company boards are we represent the interests of shareholders. You guys all know that. And we're attempting to do the best job we can for the shareholders' best interests. It's gotten harder over time in that the mandate used to be, it still is, but it used to be incredibly clear that it was to maximize value for shareholders. And now it's really moving a little bit, and we're being asked as corporations to have a broader mandate that isn't purely maximize value for shareholders, but also to figure out how to do some other good things for society, which come back circularly to maximizing value for shareholders. And we can go further into that. But as Janet mentioned, the board's job, the board's responsibility really is, first and foremost, is to hire and oversee the CEO. If you have a great CEO, the board's job is much, much easier because all of the other responsibilities really are delegated to the CEO first and foremost to be the person that is going to run with it and spend their 40, 60, 80, 100 hours a week, however many hours you think that they spend, working on. So even diversity, you would say diversity within the organization, the board mandates that for the company, but through the CEO usually, and then the CEO has to go out and make that happen. Strategic initiatives, the same thing. The board is pushing forward and saying what we want to have happen, but then it goes through the CEO, and we could talk about the other things the board does, but hiring and overseeing and potentially firing the CEO is really the board's biggest responsibility. Janet also mentioned risk management. Of course, we have to oversee risk management. If something goes wrong, we're the ones that are responsible for that. But again, usually through the CEO. But for this conversation, which is around diversity, equity, inclusion, it's a newer focus. It shouldn't be a newer focus, but it is a newer and more heightened focus. And boards are taking more of a role on this because they have to lead. And what do I mean by that? I mean, the organization in themselves are trying, and they're working hard to become more diverse. And it's diversity of thought, it's diversity of background, as you might have thought about. But the organization is really working on improving its culture. Now, again, as I mentioned before, this isn't just a societal good. It is supposed to circularly come back around to make the company better. And you heard from Dean Garrett before that the diversity of thought does make things better. We should all collectively be smarter than any one person. It's the same thing. If you have more viewpoints, we should all be smarter. But it's also so that we can relate to the workforce, and so we can relate to our customer base, right? Because the workforce and our customer base inside corporate America, I will tell you, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, is diverse. So the customers are diverse. Our workforce is diverse. So we need to be cognizant of their voices and what they're saying so that we can do a better job accurately and adequately representing all the interest and attracting and retaining talent throughout the organization because they understand that we understand what's happening inside of the company. So it's incredibly important. Unfortunately, before this push, it wasn't natural. It wasn't a natural thing for corporate America to have diverse boards. So what's happening now is really a bigger push. It should have been natural. It should have been more natural, but it's not. And sorry, I'm taking too long, but it should have been more natural, but there was a challenge. There was and people would talk about it as a feeder problem, right? So if you don't have the executive ranks that are filled with a more diverse population, then when you're naturally searching for board members who have certain skill sets, the feeder for that, the farm system for that, which are the normal executives of companies, isn't stocked with the same amount of diversity in its talent base for you to be able to choose. And so what's going on right now is the unnatural forcing, which is going to be good, in that we have to change the narrative, and we have to lead by example, and we have to make sure that the boards are being very responsible in representing the interests of the corporation and responsible in pushing that same, what should be natural diversity throughout the organization. Long answer to the question about how do boards work.
Can I just bridge on one quick thing?
Yeah, go for it, go for it.
So I want to tie something that the dean said and a couple of things you said together, because the language actually, so that I love the clubbable language. And when you asked us in the hallway if we knew what it meant, I didn't know, but I had a hypothesis, and I was generally right. The language.
Really, that second one too, with the hitting over the head?
That one, I would actually borrow that very correctly from you. I will give you full credit. The language that I grew up with that I think is so applicable to this conversation was he or she doesn't have boardroom presence. That was this code, like clubbable. And interesting that boardroom was picked as a language, even with people who were nowhere near the boardroom. That was this code language for didn't sort of look, walk, and talk the same, and was the tricky part is that it got used as shorthand, of course, but it wasn't actionable either. So even for people much younger in their career than they'd be thinking about going to the boardroom, it was this very generic phrase, which gets to your point in and around enough people who are boardroom ready, which is a very broad set of things, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of the creative ways you've expanded the boards that you have responsibility for, but this idea of boardroom presence being this code for something that was about can you be in the club is work. I know I personally am working very hard to dissuade and getting to specifics and examples and what leads you to that place, which I'm sure you'll take us there, but I don't want to lose the thread in tying those two pieces together because I think it's super important.
So let's talk about one way to tie your two examples here together in terms of one of the forceful, if not mandated, ways in which, in this case, government is taking on to include more women on boards. Janet, can you help us understand a little bit the context surrounding the mandates for one woman on a board in California? So this was a bill or law that was passed in January of this year in the state of California, mandating that any publicly traded company headquartered in California, so that includes your friends Facebook and Alphabet, aka the parent company of Google, must have at least one woman on the board by 2020. And by 2021, depending on the size of the board, that must increase to either 2 or 3 women. So I'm going to stop there and have you help us understand the context surrounding this, and what do you think what are the implications of this?
Yeah, so you actually did a great job of summarizing the legislation. I'd be remiss if I didn't also add that I live in Chicago, the state of Illinois, did a much more watered down version of that legislation, which is essentially requiring companies to, whether they are public or private, report their board diversity. And then there are a number of examples across Europe of countries that have also mandated some level of board diversity, usually gender, to that end. I will tell you that I do believe that legislation in and around board diversity is a very blunt instrument. And is a blunt instrument that the legislatures, whether they were of a state, a city, or a country, decided that the momentum was not quick enough, even though everyone had the best of intentions, the momentum was not quick enough to advance the conversation. I went from being pretty skeptical of the idea that we had to use legislation to change the conversation in the boardroom to being someone who was actually quite supportive of that legislation. And that's been a big change just over the last, call it 3 or 4 years in my thinking. I am extremely concerned and sensitive to the idea that it is mandated, this should be organic, women in this case, but pick whether it is veterans or underrepresented minorities or diverse populations, that it should be obvious. Of course they should be there. They have the experience and the skill set. But I've come to the place at seeing how slow the change has been that I am a believer in a legislative dimension to change the conversation. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that there are a handful of things that absolutely we have to pay very, very careful attention to. Because of course, a blunt instrument is just that and can have very unintended consequences. I'm thinking about how to draw the club analogy in and the clubbable blunt instrument into the conversation. So the first is that I believe that boards have to be incredibly sensitive and aware of not falling into the tokenism trap and having their 1 or 2 or 3 women be viewed and treated in the boardroom as being there because they have to be, as opposed to, okay, they have to be, however, their skills and capabilities and the inclusive nature with which we've created this boardroom will allow us to have a much, much, much stronger boardroom. So how we make sure that tokenism does not become the fatal flaw and the incredible risk of this legislation, and how we can create culture in boardrooms to not let that happen, I think that's the real call to action. I think for those of us that have the privilege to lead boardrooms, to make sure that we don't fall into that trap or that conundrum that is so easy to fall into.
So I'm going to add another layer to this and give Jeff the chance to respond as well. But earlier this summer, I was invited to testify on Capitol Hill to the U.S. House Financial Services Committee to talk about this topic of board diversity. And I spent a lot of time trying to understand, what is the federal government doing with the conversation about board diversity? And I found out that there were two bills. One's referred to as the Maloney bill, and the other one I believe is the Meeks bill. And each bill is not necessarily focused on how many should be on the board, but trying to get companies to release their data around diversity on the board and diversity in the company. So I don't know to what extent, Jeff, you've had interactions with the federal government or local governments around this topic of board diversity, but would love to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, Stephanie, it's I believe that the market now is doing a much better job at self-policing, and as we all know, companies are owned by their shareholders, and there are some very large long-only mutual funds that are doing a much better job now as long-term shareholders. They own these companies. They're going to own them for a long time at caring about how they're being governed. And there's also proxy advisory firms, ISS and Glass Lewis. I don't know how many know about them. So proxy advisory firms who are also doing a better job on this as well. So I believe that disclosure is getting better and is being demanded by the shareholders already. I also believe that the diversity is already being demanded by the shareholders. It took too long, but it is happening now, and so I don't know that increased legislation is necessary. I think if it's extra disclosure, that's fine, but I think that's happening anyway. As an example, BlackRock, Vanguard, T. Rowe, many others are already sending letters to companies. We get them. We as public company board members, we get these letters, and the letters say they're starting right now on gender. I believe they will move. But they're starting on gender, and the letter says, we are long-time shareholders of your company, and we believe that diversity of thought is incredibly important, and there's a couple paragraphs on that, and then it says, we expect that you should have at least one female board member on the board, or you should have at least 2 female board members on the board. Those letters are incredibly powerful. I will tell you, boards, we can go on a whole sidebar here, but boards, don't often, boards that I'm not involved with, don't often move as fast as they should. And getting a letter like that from your large shareholders is incredibly powerful. Or letters from your large shareholders that say anything else are incredibly powerful. And some of them imply that they are going to vote based on your adherence. Some of them don't go quite as far. But I will tell you that's more than enough. I will tell you, as soon as that happens, those companies fix that problem right away. One step further are the proxy advisory firms, ISS and Glass Lewis. So ISS and Glass Lewis are the 2 largest proxy advisory firms. They're extremely powerful. So what they do, you probably read about them in the news, is they put out reports talking about how they believe their clients, who are the shareholders, should vote on different matters, including for board members. And so that makes them incredibly powerful. And they used to just put out a report on, and let's just use ISS, on a quality score where they would talk about the quality of the performance of the board and the company. They now have a separate report that comes out talking about environmental, social initiatives, and there's a score on that, and governance, which will also talk about diversity. So this is happening, and again, it took too long, but it is happening, and it's not going to stop. And so I understand that the politicians want to get involved, and maybe they want to get involved now because they can take the victory lap because they'll put it in and it's going to happen anyway. But we're going in the right direction. It took too long, and I believe it becomes self-policing now from the shareholder base.
Okay.
So I think a couple interesting reflections, because I think you and I actually come at this from very much the same mindset, I do think the conversation needs to broaden beyond gender, as we've begun to very gently talk about today. But I also think there's a high exposure in sort of this theme of clubbable is what we're seeing, and studies absolutely show that the same women and underrepresented minorities are getting on all of the boards. And so whereas I think the average placement on a Fortune 500 board is like one and a half boards that each member sits on. For women, it's 3.5. And so recycle rate is the term that's being used. So that is, I'm certainly happy that there are more women on boards, but to the diversity of thought perspective, you don't just want it to be the same women that are across all the boards, or the same black leaders who are across all the boards. So I think that's the next step and the next push for us collectively is, one is that they're there, which is fabulous, and then to make sure that the aperture continues to open up to a broader set of leaders in the market.
You know, it's interesting. Sorry, I'll jump in also.
We can't help ourselves.
Go ahead.
And I'm going to do very, very fast. But it's actually interesting. It's very interesting as it relates to the recycle rate, and we deal with that all the time.
I bet you do.
But the flip side to that, and is something that we have to get past, which is those same proxy advisory firms, when they're giving their recommendation around board members, often highly value board experience. So if you highly value board experience, then board members are going to be searching for other board members who have board experience. If there are fewer women and minorities that have board experience, and board experience is the thing that's most highly valued, it becomes more difficult to fix this problem. So we have to change the prioritization. And we have to say, yes, board experience is important, but maybe it's not the most important. And in the past, it was deemed to be the most important. And I think partly because people were asking the same question, does that person know how to behave in the boardroom? And it was a very important question for people. They were worried. One of the biggest criticisms for activist investors coming inside the boardroom was they're going to be disruptive. You're not going to be able to behave in the boardroom, you're going to be disruptive. It's actually one of the biggest concerns with placing somebody else in the boardroom that has a diversity of thought. They're not going to be able to get along with everybody else, they're going to be disruptive. The interesting thing is, you all, I was going to say we, you all value that more than we, as our generations, ever did before. So Gen Z fully expects this, wants diversity of thought, and you are the ones that are leading this charge. You are the ones that are saying, we want people that are leading these companies that care about the world and care about other things that weren't cared about before. This is all happening and accelerating because the Gen Z level wants this. And since the Gen Z level wants this and companies need to attract employees, it's getting accelerated because corporate leadership needs to make sure that they're doing the right thing at the top of the organization, that your generation is going to think is attractive for you to go inside of a company. So some of you are looking for jobs, right? Some of you at some point are looking for jobs. I hope some of you are looking for jobs. When you're looking at companies that you want to look for, how many of you care about their purpose and their social purpose and what they're going to do for society? How many of you care about that? Right, right. I will tell you that when I went to school here, I'm not sure as many people would have raised their hands. I mean, that's not, it's a little funny, it's a little sad, but I'm not sure as many people would have raised their hands. And that's what's changing the world. You guys have the power to change the world. You're making this difference. I'll stop.
So
So-
yes and.
so-
Okay, can I do one more
Yeah.
line? And I promise
Yeah.
So yes and. The topics that are being
That's
discussed.
your improv training?
In the boardroom. It is my improv training, yes. My theater and music career clearly gone way awry. The topics that are being discussed in the boardroom. Diversity in the boardroom, incredibly important to the next generation of leaders like you all. But the topics are so complicated and so diverse in their sophistication. The issues that organizations are facing, I believe, are at a record high in terms of complexity and speed. And so more brains around the table, more voices, more disruption in the conversation, I believe is a market imperative as well. It's an employee talent imperative, but it's also a market imperative. Because if we don't have the right voices around both the executive table and the boardroom table and those voices talking to each other, I think that's a big exposure point for us.
Okay,
Back
so
to you.
you two make a compelling case, and I think Jeff is sufficiently warmed up to talk about Papa John's, because you know they're waiting for me to ask you the question about Papa John's. So let me actually help you understand the context under which Jeff and I met. I went on then Knowledge at Wharton Radio back in the spring, and he's going to talk about this as well, because what they'd asked me to come on and talk about was Shaquille O'Neal a good choice of a board member, speaking of criteria, which we'll talk about as well, for Papa John's. Now, I actually came to find out about some of the challenges that Papa John's had been having through my students, who are required at the end of every term to do a case study of a company that's wrestling with a diversity issue. And so I have seen a number of presentations about Papa John's, and so I was sufficiently warmed up to go on the radio. I think it was probably about a week after the show had aired, I get an email from Jeff saying, "Hi, I'm the chair of the board of Papa John's. Do you want to talk?" And I'm thinking, oh shoot, what did I say? And he's a Wharton alum. I was like, oh no, I've made the alum mad. This is not what I wanted to do. And we had, hands down, one of the best conversations I've ever had with an alum, and certainly somebody who's in a senior position. And it was a deeply honest conversation. And I said, do you want to come to Wharton and talk to the students about it? So this is actually, he already knows he's going to talk about this. So I have found the best way to have Jeff help us understand how he and how boards get involved in extremely complicated issues around CEOs and their belief systems, and how that affects populations of people, is to just let Jeff tell the story. So I'm going to not ask questions. I'm just going to have you, what you did for me, I think, was talk to me about the context behind when you got involved, and sort of starting with the conference call that John Schnatter had that got us to this point. So could you help us to understand the story so we all hear it from you, and then we'll follow up?
Sure.
Thank you.
How much time do we have?
She's been flashing.
I know.
8 minutes.
8 minutes.
There you go.
Okay. I'll try.
You told it in 7 the other day, I counted.
Okay, so Papa John's, I'll try and do it fast. So I'm sure most of you know some of the story. It's been big news. So now, 18 months, a couple of years ago, Papa John's was doing really well. As you know, John, the chairman, CEO, and founder, was running the company. They had a big affiliation with the NFL. Sales started going the wrong direction. My opinion, based on them taking their eye off the ball in terms of running the business, but they were blaming it, John was blaming it on the NFL and the national anthem controversy. And so there was a conversation on the conference call where there was criticism of the NFL's handling of the controversy against the wishes of the board. So there was a conversation in the boardroom where he discussed that was an issue that was driving sales in the wrong direction. The board very clearly told him, you should not be discussing that publicly. He did anyway. And then the customer base, some portion of the customer base boycotted, and sales went down. And the board took a very difficult position because John, as the founder of the company, had 30% ownership in the company and had been running the company since he founded it. And they removed him from CEO, and they elevated somebody from within to be the CEO. Then you fast forward about 6 months or 9 months from then, and which I guess would be the end of last year, about a year ago. And he was trying to come back because he felt like the business was performing really poorly, and he believed it was because he was no longer involved and no longer the face of the company. And in order to come back, the board and he decided that he needed to get some media coaching before he came back, because if he came back, there was going to be some criticism and questions. And unfortunately, on that private conference call that he had with advisors who were supposed to coach him, he unfortunately used the N-word, and those consultants then quit. And as part of that, also that the reason they quit got leaked, and it became a big story. And then there was a I forget, some magazine article about the culture inside Papa John's, and it wasn't so great. And then sales went down even further. So you had a company that was really in disarray. Founder owned 30% of the company. The board then took away his chair responsibility. Still on the board, because board members cannot be removed from a board if they've been elected by shareholders until you get to the next annual meeting. So he's still on the board with the other board members. The other board members have decided to take him out from CEO, out of the chair role, but he's still on the board, owns 30% of the company, and the board and sales are declining. They're down 10%. Same-store sales continue to be down 10%. Same-store sales. It's not good. So we approached the company and said we thought we could help, but the company really needed help on an operational from an operational standpoint. They needed to turn around the business. They needed to operate better, because some of this was just masking the fact that Domino's was kicking their ass. So we needed to fix the operational element and be able to challenge Domino's, and we needed to provide permission back to our customers who loved us but were boycotting us with a change in culture. So we worked with the financial advisors, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, as well as Lazard, and we were invited into the company, which is highly, highly unusual, but says something about who we are and how operational we are and how we could, be a good influence on the company. So we were invited into the company. We changed half the board. I became the chair. We made a $250 million investment in the company. I sat down with John and explained to John that he was not going to be renominated for the board. He was going to run a proxy contest. I explained to him that wouldn't be good for him, wouldn't be good for the company, and he did not do that. And we went forward. Again, we've replaced half the board, so 6 out of 10 board members are new. Half the board is diverse, gender, and ethnic, depending on how you want to look at it. So we have now a diverse board. The culture has changed dramatically in terms of acceptance for everybody's thought and everybody being included. It's one of our new CEO, Rob Lynch's, top priorities is leadership who appreciates and supports diversity and inclusion is one of the top priorities inside the company. And we just announced, I'm really short-circuiting this, and I'll come back to Shaquille. So, and we just announced last week, the first quarter of positive same-store sales in 2 years. So very, very good. Along the way, we had the opportunity, as it relates to the board, to have Shaquille O'Neal come in, and I know you guys have seen Shaquille in the commercial. Have any of you seen a cameo? Have any of you seen the Shaquille commercials? Yes? Have any of you seen a cameo of me in
Jeff
the
in the
Shaquille
background. He's in the back. You have to look close.
look again.
I saw it last weekend, and when I talked to Jeff last week, I said, you're in this commercial? It was really funny. I was watching this. There's several of them, and I said, hey, it's Jeff in the back. You're looking really official.
Kind of like this. So Shaquille actually came to us and said he loves the brand. He's been loving the brand since when he was in college at LSU, and he wanted to get involved because he thought he could make a difference. He said, pizza is not racist. He did. Pizza's not racist. And he thought he could make a difference, and he thought this was, and I agree with him, it's part of our draw for getting involved in the company was not just the investment, but it's the doing good. It's the microcosm of if you can take one company and really turn it around and make it better and make it go. America loves a comeback story. So if you can get involved in one company that had a culture that really wasn't ideal, and you can flip it on its head and try and make it the ideal, that's so rewarding and so powerful, and that's what we're doing. That's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to get better, we're trying to get to best. Not that easy to do, but that's what we're striving to do. And Shaquille wanted to do a very similar thing, and we got together and I said to Shaquille, I don't know why you want to do this. It's a lot of time in the boardroom. This is not the best use of your time. You're not going to get paid for your time spent in the boardroom. He very much wanted to do it. He wanted to do it because he wanted to learn. So people don't know this, but Shaquille O'Neal is a big learner. He appreciates learning. He left school after his junior year. He went back to LSU to get his degree. He promised his mom he'd go back to school. He then got his MBA. I don't know how many people know he has an MBA. He got an MBA. He then got a PhD. He's a doctor in education. He then went to the police academy and went all the way through to become a detective. And he also has told us that he wants to become a lawyer. So he's very.
He sounds like our students.
Yeah, he's very interested in learning. And so when we talked about it, he said, look, I know restaurants. And I think we talked about this before. You can't just, it's not authentic. You can't just bring in a token person into the boardroom. He was attractive because of who he is and because of his knowledge. He's a restaurateur, and a franchise restaurateur. So he's owned franchise restaurants for years, very, very successfully. He knows restaurants. So getting him to come on the board and getting his thoughts as it relates to how to run franchise restaurants, enormously valuable. And being able to get his viewpoints, enormously valuable. I will tell you, the things that he finds important to discuss in the boardroom are different than the things that we traditionally find important to talk about in the boardroom. And they're eye-opening, and they're great. And his thinking around pricing, his thinking about marketing is different, and it's great. So it's been an amazing experience for me personally, but an amazing experience, I think, for the company and for the board, and I know I'm going over on time, so I'm going to pause there.
So I'm going to let Timka and, do you have the only mic running?
I have Papa John's gift cards for anybody who asks questions.
Do you really?
I do.
He really does have these gift cards. Okay, this was not planned. Janet, I'm going to give you a chance to respond. I actually wanted you to say... So
I do not have gift cards.
No
Deloitte I can one up, definitely not in this case.
No Deloitte gift cards today. But Janet, I wanted you to say a few words about, so if this is the atypical case around how we take people who are atypical in terms of experience and put them on boards, that's not going to be the story of many of our students here who want to someday potentially be on a board. So what are like the 3 things they should be thinking about as we're about to take questions and answers from the audience?
Yeah, outside of being an MBA all-star
Yes.
who has 8 degrees. So a few things. So one is I would encourage you, and maybe this is a little selfish, to actually, as you are launching your career or the next phase of your career, understand just a little bit about and ask some questions about the governance of the organization that you're joining. A little bit to Jeff's point where sort of social impact was not, it was not an aggressive part of the conversation when we were in school. Neither really was governance. Governance has raised in importance coming out of Sarbanes-Oxley and now in today's totally changed in the conversation. So one is get smart about the governance, both the diversity of the board and the role of the board in the organizations that you're considering joining, to just begin to be part of the conversation as you launch or continue your career. The second thing I would encourage you to do is get engaged in a not-for-profit board. That is something that is a deep passion for you, of yours personally. And it's easy to get involved as a volunteer, obviously, in a not-for-profit organization, and I'm sure all of you do that in some form or fashion. But getting just a little bit of governance experience under your belt earlier in your career can be invaluable as you think about how do you change your hat from being someone who is doing and or leading to one who is guiding and challenging and being sort of the ultimate fiduciary responsibility for the mission. It's a very, very different set of muscles. And the earlier you start to practice those, the better prepared you'll be, I believe, to be a wonderful corporate board member as well. So those are a couple of things I would encourage you to do and spend time on.
Okay, a couple of questions. Who wants to go first? Yes, you guys can give it to whoever you would like, yes.
First, thank you guys so much for being here. Really appreciate your time. My question, I guess, is really pointed towards Jeff. I mean, I know you have been on a lot of boards before, quite successfully, and I am wondering how you begin to qualify decisions when the numbers aren't necessarily clear and there's not really a lot of precedent. Like, having been in some like investment committees myself, it's not necessarily about what feels right, but more about like the numbers on the page and like what the model says in terms of what the right decision is to make.
Yeah, maybe I'll twist that around a little bit. Board decisions are very, very hard, which is what you're referencing. It's extremely difficult. And as an activist investor, we actually work really hard to try not to criticize past decisions as much as many others do, because in hindsight, it's really easy to criticize the past decisions. And so we work really hard when we're talking to companies from the outside about how, yes, you made mistakes in the past. Everybody makes mistakes, but those are big mistakes usually if we're getting involved. So you made mistakes in the past, but then we switch it and we talk about these are the key decisions you have right in front of you right now, and this is what we think is most important, and we think you're going in the wrong direction. We want you to change that direction right now. As it relates to the boardroom and those decisions, which I think is where you want to go, board members do a great job of making decisions if they have the choices in front of them. One of the biggest challenges that happens for board members and in the boardroom is that's not how board dynamics actually work. The way board dynamics actually work is the CEO and management actually come to the board and they say, this is our plan and our recommendation. It's not, here are the three choices and we're recommending A. They just say, here's A and we're recommending A. That's not so easy, right? I mean, you guys would be like, what are you talking about? That's how it works. They say, here's A and we're recommending A. That's really hard. So what we try to do when we get in the boardroom is to, if it's a tough decision, is to talk about, well, what is the other choice? And let's make sure we actually talk about the two choices in the boardroom and put numbers beside it, but also try and qualitatively assess the pros and cons, the risk and the reward. Because in the ordinary course, you don't normally have both of those choices there. So that's what we try and get involved, get done in order to make it easier.
All right, someone over here, a question? Right over here, yes.
Hello, thank you guys again for coming. So you both have obviously served in a lot of influential and powerful positions and everything like that. And if you're in those positions, you have a lot of say in like the culture of the company and everything like that. So I guess as the next generation of people who will be like moving into these positions, as you guys mentioned earlier, is there anything that you both know now, whether culturally or otherwise, in terms of diversity that you wish you knew when you were first starting out or in our position?
I would, the thing that on topic I would point to is to be very deliberate in the investment that you make in relationships throughout the course of your career, and make sure that it's very easy to be clubbable in the relationships that you make. No matter who you are, it is very easy to want to surround yourself with people that walk, talk, and act like you. And so the thing I would encourage you to think about is how you are deliberate about how you invest your relationship time in, of course, people who you are the most comfortable with. That is what comes naturally to all of us. But to also be much more deliberate about doing that with a broader set of leaders. You know, I have sort of what for me has become an age-old saying, which is where you should invest your relationship time. And I've said this for many years, which is if you have 10 extra hours a day, week, or month, you should spend 1 hour up, 4 hours down, and the rest should be with your peers. Because I do believe, and that's one of the things I love about seeing a cohort like this, I do think your peers are the most valuable relationships you'll have, in addition to your team, obviously. But diversity in that set of peers is the thing that I believe has, my thinking has evolved the most significantly about the need and importance of doing that over the course of my career.
We have a question over here. Timka's coming on down. I'll let you pick. No pressure.
I apologize, another question for Mr. Smith. But when you looked at the AECOM investment, did you ever look into changing any board members or with diversity or any other lens? And secondly, how did you view the sale of MS, the $2.4 billion sale of MS on that end?
Just that.
We have an investment in a company called AECOM, and it's a two-part question. Have we thought about the board and addressing changes there, including diversity for diversity purposes? And they recently sold the division for about $2.5 billion, and how do we feel about that? We're happy they sold the division. We wanted them to sell the division. I think it's an okay price. And as it relates to the board, yes, we look at the board, and in order to improve the company, we oftentimes change board members. So that one's still ongoing.
I think we have time for one more question over here. Sorry. Can you hold your hand up high so she can...
We could do this all day, but we know you have case groups and meetings and classes. And
Again, thank you both for being here. I thought the topic of the recycle rate was really interesting. And I'm curious, it sounds like there's a lot of initiative around making boards more diverse, but then it's easy to go back to the same people. And especially when you want somebody who's boardroom ready, how do you start changing the conversation and giving more people the opportunity such that you don't need to, one, rely on recycle rate, and then you just get more comfortable in general that people deserve a chance?
yeah, so I'll take the first cut at that. So for sure, the conversation is evolving in the corporate circles. And it used to be you really wanted standing CEOs or standing CFOs or just retired CEOs or CFOs to be on your boards, and that was in addition to board service. And so that conversation is starting to evolve and mature to be a more balanced conversation. One is given the variety of not only diversity, but also skills and capabilities that you need to be an effective board today. And I'm sure, Jeff, you have some perspective on that. But I would also say there's a lot of not-for-profits that are really focused in this space. So I'm a couple stops away in my week this week. I'm going to meet with the CEO of an organization called the Board List. There's an organization called the 30% Club. There's an organization called Him for Her. All organizations that are focused on trying to broaden the number of women and diverse and racial diversity that are boardroom ready and have a compelling conversation to have in terms of their readiness for the board. So those are a couple of dimensions of things that I see happening.
Do you want to...
Yeah, Jocelyn Mangan runs Him for Her.
Yeah.
She's on the Papa John's board with me. So it's a great organization, charity, where their sole purpose is to find women and support them getting into board positions.
Really a broker.
Yeah, but without getting paid.
Exactly, a not-for-profit broker. Imagine
So,
that.
look, boards just need to do a better job of this, and it's just not as professionally done. Again, I'm going to talk about boards we're not involved in, but it's just not. It's
And
just
not my
not.
clients.
It's just not as professionally done as it should be. This search. So, historically, it was usually done if there was a vacancy. Very rarely do boards actually actively kick people off. So if there was, they should, but very, very rarely do they actively kick people off. And then if there's a vacancy, oftentimes they would use their own network to find somebody, which talks to, Janice's discussion about diversifying your network. Well, people don't normally or haven't diversified their network, so the network's going to look like they do. And then even if they do a search, my experience is the search is usually relatively short and not as time consuming as it should be when you're making an investment in somebody who's coming on your board. So how do you change it? You put more energy behind it, you put more effort behind it, and you push for diversity of thought. I mean, it's just like anything else. You have to decide it's a priority. I will tell you, unfortunately, in the past, I'm not sure it was as much of a priority as it should have been. I'll also say, now to get on a soapbox, there's also other dynamics that are involved in the boardroom. So as I mentioned before, the CEO is the most important person, and the CEO is being governed by the board, but the board normally delegates a lot of responsibility to the CEO, which includes sometimes finding other board members. And who does the CEO want to find for another board member that they're going to put in the boardroom? They're going to want to find somebody that's going to support them so that they're more comfortable in their seat. So all of this is circular. Janet's board is different. I mean, she was talking about how her board runs. You could talk about that yourself, but that's a much better model where it really is much more independent as it relates to the board searching for its own members and the constituents caring a lot about it. Unfortunately, in the public arena, the shareholders are a little too far away and you have an agency problem. We're working on it. We're fixing it. It's getting better, but there's work to be done.
So we could certainly go on for another hour. And I hope for those of you who have not participated in a conversation about board diversity that this effectively gives you more grounding to start reading the articles, including the ones from my class that are about board diversity, the one that was assigned today. And I think certainly to start paying attention more. As I mentioned, the federal government is jumping right in there. We have some bills being passed through. We certainly have a lot of demand, consumers believing that the board job is to fix the diversity issues of the company. But what we've heard here today is that that's not the easiest thing to do because there's a separation of responsibilities legally between the board and the company. So hopefully this helps you to understand that a little bit more. Certainly it goes without saying I am extremely grateful to Janet and to Jeff, who are extremely busy people who took the time out of their lives to be here with us today. So we are grateful. Thank you so much for being here. You've taught us a lot. And thank you all for being here as well, Dean Garrett. I also want to thank the events team at the Wharton School for doing a lot of work to pull this together, Genevieve and Jen. I want to thank Natalia Villerman, who is one of my TAs who led the organization of this event. The others who have supported today, Olivia and Kate, and to Timka as well. So if you're interested in future events on the topic of diversity in organizations, you have to look no further than the Leading Diversity at Wharton events website at the Wharton School. And we look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you all for being here.